Hello and welcome to Epochs number 98 with Bo, as always, and he's here today to tell us all about Göbekli Tepe, but I do also know a bit about this as well as being quite a hunter-gatherer enthusiast, which sounds like a euphemism, but I actually am just keen in that period of human history. Obviously, we've covered the origin of humanity and the evolution of that, and I am into my bushcraft and survival skills. So I think a lot of that feeds into this, what seems to be proto-civilization.
Well, that's it. That's exactly it. Göbekli Tepe and sites like it isn't entirely unique, or it is in some ways. But anyway, it's the story of when early men first really began to do agriculture. It represents now. We first thought it was just a complete anomaly, like 25, 30 years ago when it was first discovered. Now we see it really does sort of fit in really with the view of when humans first started agriculture, because the idea is that, the low resolution wrong idea is that at some point men just started doing that, perhaps in Mesopotamia. It now seems actually it was a long process with stops and starts. It wasn't just, you don't just go from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to farmers.
That's true of lots of aspects of human history, really, isn't it? Especially in those earlier years when we covered all of the different hominid species. It's not simply that one stops and another begins. There's lots of overlap where they coexist together, or something that has become extinct elsewhere is still living on in some isolated island somewhere.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's, for example, the island of Flores had tiny little hobbit people when modern humans existed. So if that doesn't go to serve that point, I don't know what would.
There's still hunter-gatherer nomadic peoples today, in the world today, right?
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, you've got the Amazon, you've got obviously Papua New Guinea, although I think they've got modern firearms now. But obviously there's also North Sentinel Island, which I think is the purest, most uncontacted tribe, in that they're hostile to any outsiders, which is pretty good border policy as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's like nomadic peoples in Central Asia, in Mongolia, and I think up in Siberia, there's sort of, there are people that follow the reindeer herds around still.
They're sort of steppe people, aren't they? Akin to that, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. So still primitive. And like you say, people in the Amazon, some places in the Amazon, we know there are people that have had no contact. Like a small aeroplane or a helicopter's flown over and we've seen them.
Shoot arrows at it.
Normally, yeah, they've had no contact with the modern world whatsoever. So the idea that at some point in around Eridu or in southern Mesopotamia, about 5,500 BC, humans just started to become farmers. Well, it didn't work like that. And so Göbekli Tepe, and I'll describe what it is for anyone who doesn't know in a minute, is just one piece in the puzzle of our view of how and when that transition might have happened. So first of all then, just a little bit of a description of what Göbekli Tepe is. And I'll be putting up loads of pictures as normal. And it is sort of a fascinating, sort of in a way scarcely believable thing in some ways, because it's so ancient. In the next epochs, I'm talking about the Sumerians with the sort of the first proper cities, sort of with a stratified culture, and where they have got irrigation and all sorts of things. And they seem to have been, the earliest ones, seem to have been sort of the mid-5th millennia BC. The earliest parts of Göbekli Tepe, which is in southeastern Turkey, right in extreme southeast Turkey, date from about 10,000 BC.
It's very difficult to fathom, isn't it? Because the pyramids, which are often cited as being really ancient structures, they're 2,500 years old, so from about 500 BC-ish.
Oh no, it's more like 2,500 BC, the pyramids.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah,
I'm misremembering.
Yeah. Right. But still, Göbekli Tepe is like 7,000 years older than that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, really, isn't it?
Right, yeah. So that's how old Göbekli Tepe is, about 7,000 years older than the pyramids. So sort of mind-boggling. It's back in what they sometimes call deep time. It sort of goes back, we're in the Holocene period, sort of the geographic, in terms of, well, there's all different ways to measure epochs of time or bits of time, aren't there? There's the geological one. Anyway, this is back in the Neolithic, or sort of the New Stone Age.
Yes.
That's what Neolithic is.
That much we know from the site as well, because they found lots and lots of discarded flint.
Yeah, that was what was first found, almost sort of on the surface. And we'll get into the detail of the actual archaeology in a moment. But so you've got sort of the sort of old and middle Stone Age, and then there's sort of the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, where there's more. It's just a more sophisticated use of tools. But just before I get into that, I do want to talk about, try and match it up with some of the other conversations we've had before on contemplations about truly ancient people. So we know for a fact that there's been what we would call biologically modern humans have been around for 3, 4, maybe 500,000 years, right?
Yeah, I think it's almost fair to say that it could be as far back as 300,000. That would be where I might draw a distinction. But modern in the sense of, they would be somewhat compatible. I like to think of it modern in the cultural sense and modern in the biological sense. So in the cultural sense, you could take someone, say, from the medieval period to the modern day, and as long as they're young enough, they can be moulded to live in our society. Whereas if you go to, say, 400,000 years ago, then they don't have the biology to integrate with the culture, the society, because they might not even have the brain capacity to live in this modern world. Right.
But nonetheless, early humans were sort of able to nap stone, make hand axes, like over 1 million years ago, over 1.5 million years ago.
And to a very impressive degree. Even the ones that were found in Dmanisi in Georgia, which is matters of millions of years ago, they hadn't even got fire. They'd been eating raw meat. But the napping on the stone, is quite good. It's not napping in the truest sense of the word, in that it's rounded on one end and it's kind of filed to a point. But that still requires some skill.
A lot of skill.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they date back, the oldest ones of those can date back, well, they do date back well over 1 million years. And then when you get
up to 2 million in some cases.
And then when you do get truly napped pieces of art almost, they're still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years old.
Yes.
So anyway, to how do we go from that to something like Göbekli Tepe, where there's, they're definitely modern humans, and they're definitely sophisticated in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, but still long before any modern city, long before pottery. So it dates from the what they call the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. They're the oldest bits of Göbekli Tepe, about 9,500 BC, 10,000 BC. There's even parts of the site which haven't been excavated yet, which look to be older, could be like 13,000 years before present. So they're definitely modern humans, but it all predates, like they've mastered fire, they've mastered stone napping, they've mastered fire, but no one's ever made any pottery yet. The wheel hasn't been invented. Okay, so it's so unbelievably old, right? And so the question is, and there's obviously no agriculture. Well, not obviously, that's part of this story. But there's no real agriculture. There's no
predating this point. Yeah,
there's no animal husbandry. But they do have. There are settlements, small settlements, very, 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 very small villages, if you like, which date to much older than this. So, for example, there's what they call the Natufian culture. There's a thing called the Natufian culture. If you want to look that up, there'll be videos on it and a Wikipedia page on it. And so that culture is named after a particular cave. We can see that people made modern, anatomically modern, biologically modern humans made. We've got their midden pits, their trash pits, basically, their trash mounds, and we know where they had fires, their hearths. They date back for tens of thousands of years. So, for example, there's a place in modern-day Israel on the Sea of Galilee. What's it called? Ohalo is called. Ohalo 2. Okay, it's on the southern bit of the Sea of Galilee. And that dates back possibly as far as 23,000 years before present. And there are people there collecting seeds, It's not agriculture, so it's wild seeds, but they're collecting them in some sort of central place, and they're living there. They had hearth fires for generations and generations, for thousands of years, actually. So the idea that Göbekli Tepe represents the first ever structures that humans built, that's wrong. It's not that. But nonetheless, as far as we know, because archaeology may find at some point in the future new things that blow Göbekli Tepe out of the water. But as we speak in 2023, it's the oldest sort of megalithic site. And again, I'll be putting pictures up so everyone knows what we're talking about. And it's very, very, very enigmatic, isn't it? Like,
yes.
We don't know, and we'll be saying this again and again in this one, we don't know exactly its purpose. We don't know the peoples who built it and their culture and what they thought of it, and what they were doing exactly.
These are always some of my favourite historical puzzles, if you will, because when you've got such a limited amount to infer from, it's almost a bit like a detective story. And I actually have a theory about that. I don't want to say what I actually believe yet, because I don't want to spoil the information that you're going to give out and throw everything out of whack. But I will say that it's no mistake that it's within the Fertile Crescent. I don't know whether you're getting onto that.
No, go ahead.
So basically, if you're not familiar, the Fertile Crescent is, believe it or not, a crescent shape as viewed on a modern world map, stretching from Egypt, particularly around the Nile, surprise, surprise, going up through sort of Israel, Syria, and into sort of Mesopotamia. So that's modern day Iraq, perhaps parts of Iran, that area. What would have been known as perhaps the Persian area, not at the time, obviously, though, but what we might call it. And so this is a very key area for early human beings because, of course, as the name suggests, it's quite a fertile area, because around the time we're talking, the time of some of the earliest structures in Göbekli Tepe being built, this is towards the waning of the Ice Age and or the actual end of the Ice Age. And thus, these areas in the Fertile Crescent are actually some of the most habitable for human beings. So you would imagine that if you're a hunter-gatherer, there would be an abundance of game, wild berries, nuts, things that you could live off and live quite comfortably as a hunter-gatherer if you knew what you were doing. Obviously, it's certainly not an easy life by a modern standard, but from a historic one, it was as easy as it gets when compared to, say, human ancestors or other animals. And I think that's why you get lots of things in this area, like the first evidence we have of human-made fire comes from Israel and these sorts of areas. And of course, it's also worth mentioning that Africa did play a key role in the development of human beings. So it makes sense that close to the land bridge out of Africa, what would be obviously where the Suez Canal is now, that would likely be the way in which many hominids migrated outwards, although we did have a problem with the out of Africa hypothesis in that hominids had existed outside of Africa in Europe and Asia and parts of Australasia for basically a million years or so, maybe even a couple of million before anatomically modern humans were on the scene. So to say it's just Africa is just wrong. It's incorrect because it seems like there was this milieu of various hominid species that eventually we benefited from the world in which they navigated. And I think that it certainly is a key flashpoint to bring up in human history, Göbekli Tepe, because it's my understanding, at least, or my personal pet theory, I should say, that it's the dawn of agriculture that is perhaps the onus for building this structure. But I'll get onto that. I don't want to spoil my reasoning quite yet. So please do carry on.
It's interesting you mentioned the sort of the out of Africa hypothesis, which does seem to have all sorts of holes in it. However, we can also say, like the East African Rift Valley, but we can also say it does also seem to be the case that that rough area, the Fertile Crescent, from sort of southern Anatolia, southern Turkey, Egypt, and the Nile, and all the way through to Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that crescent, that lots and lots of different things at different periods, it was sort of first there. It's just that just seems to be the case until archaeology throws up a different answer to it.
I think that there's a good explanation for that if you look at it from evolutionary selection pressures. So this is what we find, generally speaking, in modern human societies, is that human beings that exist in areas where it's quite easy to be a hunter-gatherer don't have the selection pressure to adapt to their new environment, because they can live, they can have children, raise families, without the need to. But if you move out of an area where it is easy or where you're adapted to, think of, say, hominids who were clearly adapted to much warmer climates, and we still are to some extent. We're not necessarily natural to say Britain. We need to wear clothes to stay warm, right? And I don't. No other animals wear clothes, funnily enough, because they have thick coats of hair. So it indicates that we're from an area where it's hot, we're adapted to that hotter temperature. And so the further you go from these sorts of environments, the more you have to adapt. But that in itself creates a selection pressure of the kinds of hominids that you're going to find out of, say, the African area or close to the equator is, I think, a fairer way of putting it. It means that they're going to have to be more innovative by definition to survive. And there are lots of cases of pre-human hominids dying out in, say, Europe because they couldn't adapt, and they created a niche in the ecosystem for more adapted hominids to fill, which is, I think, why in part we took so well to Europe. Of course, there are lots of technological reasons as well, but where was I? Yes. So these selection pressures mean that you're going to get the people who are literally on the boundary of human civilization in a geographic sense, also being on the boundary of it in a technological sense by necessity. And therefore it makes sense that the further flung areas are going to be the places where you have these innovations. And I think this is on the sort of edge of the Fertile Crescent, isn't it? That sort of area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll mention what I'm about to say next in the next epochs about the Sumerians, but talking about how there's some sort of Goldilocks zone between being, or Arnold Toynbee, the historian, talked about it, where if an environment is too difficult, then people just can't flourish. If it's too easy, they won't innovate much.
Yes.
So you need this to be just right, where it's difficult and forces development, but it's not so tough that it's impossible.
That's a much more articulate way of saying what I was trying to say, yeah.
And it seems that in southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and the Akkadians, that seems almost certainly to have been what's playing into it. And maybe that is also, that sort of thing seems to also be in play with sites like Göbekli Tepe. Just to mention that there are, it's not unique. There are other places right near it. There's a place called Karen Tepe, which is slightly older than Göbekli Tepe. It's not quite as impressive archaeologically, but it's right near. There's lots of places right in that set of hills in southern Anatolia.
In like a 200 kilometre radius, there are other comparable structures, which of course implies some sort of shared culture, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's a Sefer Tepe, a Tassil Tepe, Hamzen Tepe, and it goes on. There's quite a lot. It's just that Göbekli Tepe is just like the best, sort of most fantastic example.
It is very impressive even today, isn't it?
And one thing I wanted to say also to talk about, to mention what you were talking about there, this transition from just early hominids, well, anatomically modern humans, but ones that have never built anything beyond just sort of the simplest hearths, and you can only imagine sort of the simplest type of reed or straw huts. And then sort of almost suddenly, although that isn't the case, but archaeologically it looks like almost suddenly sites like Karen Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, where you've got giant stone monoliths, megaliths even. So, like, what was going on there? Because they're not settled. They definitely haven't got towns or cities. They definitely haven't created pottery. But can only infer that there's all types of specialization. There's all types of cooperation going on between them.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever built Göbekli Tepe, for example, there must have been hundreds of them. They must have worked together in all sorts of ways. And the artistry shown on it, the high relief of a lot of the animals that are carved on it in high relief, that you don't just start there. It would have already had a tradition, right? You don't go from never carving anything in limestone to Göbekli Tepe just like that. It doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it suggests all sorts of things, even 10,000 BC. But quickly, one thing I have to say is that the world, it was very different in like 11, 12, 13,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned so there's the last ice age, last true ice age, which we started to come out of. And so in those ice ages, you had ice sheets that came down as far as, or covered all of Britain, came down to France, there was like giant glaciers as far as Berlin, all of Canada, most of Northern America, all the way down to sort of the Great Plains of America were covered in ice sheets. They started to recede because the world's climate is always in flux. Climate change is unavoidable. It's always going to change. But then there was another sort of fairly short, well, they're still 1,000 years long or so, of another quick cold snap, which a lot of people may have heard of if they're aware of Graham Hancock, is the Younger Dryas.
Yes, I've got this book here just on the side. It is going to come up in conversation, but I think me and Hancock deviate on a few things, although I think he has an interesting perspective, and I think that...
Oh, definitely interesting.
I just want to see a bit more evidence for this ancient advanced civilization before I can believe it.
So the so-called Younger Dryas period is a cold snap, really. It's a sort of a quick, although actually not quick, about 1,000 years, as I just said, return to Ice Age type conditions. Anyway, when that ended, at some point between 11,500 and 12,500 years ago, something in that ballpark. When that ended,
he always mentions 12,500 years ago.
Right. So as we come out of the Younger Dryas period, that's sort of the last stage of sort of nearly global glaciation. Mm-hmm. That's when places like Göbekli Tepe first appear. The oldest layers at Göbekli Tepe appear is then. And again, just in the broadest sense, it sort of makes sense because it's not on the equator, but it's not a million miles from the equator. And the conditions are sort of just about right. Even though Göbekli Tepe to this day is sort of really quite arid and dry and a bit desolate, there's not forests there. It's sort of quite a desolate landscape around there. Mm-hmm. Well, back in just after the Younger Dryas, they think it was probably lots and lots and lots of lush, fertile land that was sort of covered.
There were certainly trees as well.
Trees covered in different grasses. And when I say grasses, I mean things like wheat.
You could even
different grains,
dare to call it a temperate forest.
Was it a paradise? Was it the Garden of Eden? Anyway, we won't
you can upset
dwell on
Connor
that for too
in a
much, right? And it would have been lots and lots of fauna as well, aurochs, and all sorts of wildlife.
I know that aurochs are depicted on the actual pillars, so they must have at least had an awareness of them.
Yeah,
even if they weren't necessarily there, although I believe, if they're depicting them, they probably were.
So that's the thing. The people that lived there were hunter-gatherers, if not completely nomadic, semi-nomadic. And those types of people obviously have an extremely close relationship with animals, a symbiotic relationship almost. And we can see from Göbekli Tepe in high relief are carved all sorts of things. Foxes, lots of foxes, snakes, lots of birds, cranes, vultures, boars, gazelles, aurochs, which are giant ancient cows, really, aren't they? Bulls.
Yeah.
Spiders, scorpions. There's some little ducklings on one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, and all sorts of other weird things that aren't exactly clear what animal they're trying to depict. But obviously they had a really, really close, super close, symbiotic really relationship with wildlife.
And we can...
Just very quickly, just to
no
finish up on
worries.
that, is that they certainly aren't fully domesticated animals, though. It's not even really animal husbandry. Maybe, at best, they're sort of managing the animals around them. But there's no evidence to say that there's any actual animal husbandry going on.
To complement what you've said there, we've, not me, but humanity, modern humans, have actually analysed human genomes to try and figure out when certain cattle-borne diseases enter into, because it leaves a genetic imprint in you. And we know that by this point we hadn't domesticated any animals, because of course by domesticating animals it also exposes us to more diseases, which leaves a genetic print. There's like scarring in your genes from diseases that can be traced and dated. And we know by this point we hadn't domesticated any animals. I can't quite remember off the top of my head what period it is, but obviously it's relatively uncertain. We can't know the exact year, for example, but they have a rough idea.
Well, that's the other thing to stress, is that it didn't happen. There would be fits and starts. It was a process. There would be it looks like now, it seems, the situation, the case is that different pockets of peoples at different places did some animal husbandry, and then it was abandoned. Again, maybe for thousands of years. Again, Göbekli Tepe is 7,000 years before the pyramids, before Stonehenge. So it's like, it didn't just... It's not like today when someone finds, like, there's the invention of the mobile phone, and then suddenly the whole world's got the mobile phone, and no one's ever going to not have mobile phones again now. It's not like that. It can come and go, and did.
Well, there are parts of the world where the bow is the height of technology still to this day. Right. So the gulf has only got bigger.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.